The "I have a dream" speech almost didn't happen. Martin Luther King Jr. was reading a different speech, one nobody remembers, when a woman behind him interrupted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't written, wasn't approved. But it changed history. August 28, 1963, and Washington, D.C. is packed with 250,000 people who came for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the largest civil rights demonstration in American history, and everyone knows Martin Luther King Jr. is the main speaker, the voice they've traveled hundreds of miles to hear, the preacher who can turn moral arguments into mass movements. And he's been preparing for weeks because he understands this is the biggest audience he'll ever have, the entire nation watching. And he cannot afford to waste this moment. His prepared speech is titled, "Normalcy, Never Again," typed, edited, approved by his advisors, and it's a good speech, full of constitutional arguments and policy recommendations and careful appeals to America's conscience, but it's missing something, missing the fire and vision that makes people feel truth in their bones rather than just understand it in their minds, and King knows this, can feel it when he reads through the draft one more time backstage, but he's a responsible leader and responsible leaders don't improvise at the biggest moment of their lives, they stick to the script, they deliver what they've prepared. Mahalia Jackson is sitting behind him on the stage, the greatest gospel singer of her generation, a woman whose voice has moved millions, who knows King not just as Dr. King the civil rights leader but as Martin the preacher who sometimes talks to her about a recurring theme in his sermons, a vision he has about America's future, about his children growing up free, about a dream he carries but hasn't yet found the right moment to fully express, and she's watching him step to the podium with those typed pages and she can see the tension in his shoulders, can sense that what's on those pages isn't what this moment demands. King begins reading, "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation," and the crowd applauds because they love him, they trust him, they've come to hear him speak, but as he continues through the prepared text, talking about the Emancipation Proclamation and the promissory note that America has defaulted on for black citizens, Mahalia can feel that something is off, that the crowd is listening but not electrified, not transported, not experiencing the transcendent moment this gathering deserves. King reads through sections about police brutality and voting rights and the need for continued struggle, and it's solid, it's making his points clearly, but the rhythm isn't quite right, the fire isn't quite catching, and he's about halfway through when his voice drops slightly, when his cadence falters for just a second, and that's when Mahalia Jackson does something that will change American history. She leans forward and shouts, loud enough for King to hear, loud enough for people on the stage to turn their heads, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." Martin Luther King Jr. pauses, just for a second, maybe two, and in that pause he makes a decision that wasn't planned by any committee, wasn't approved by any advisor, wasn't part of any strategy, and he reaches out and pushes his typed speech to the side of the podium, not dramatically, just a small gesture that the cameras don't quite catch, and then he starts speaking without notes, without preparation, without safety. "And so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream." His voice shifts immediately, takes on the rhythm of a black Baptist preacher rather than a political speaker, becomes musical and rhythmic and alive in a way that the prepared text wasn't, and the crowd senses the change instantly, leans forward, begins responding not with polite applause but with call-and-response affirmations, "Yes. Tell it. Preach, Martin." The way congregations do when a sermon catches fire and the Spirit takes over. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Each repetition of, "I have a dream," gains power, becomes not just words but liturgy, incantation, vision being spoken into existence, and King isn't reading anything now, isn't consulting notes, isn't being careful, he's drawing on every sermon he's ever preached, every prayer he's ever prayed, every moment of hope he's felt despite all the violence and hatred he's witnessed, and it's pouring out of him in real time, unfiltered and raw and true. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. The crowd is standing now. People who were fanning themselves in the August heat are forgetting the temperature. People who came for a political demonstration are experiencing something closer to prophecy because King has stopped making arguments and started painting pictures, stopped addressing minds and started speaking to souls, and television cameras are capturing every second, broadcasting it live to millions of Americans who tuned in expecting a protest and are witnessing something they've never seen before. A black preacher speaking truth to the entire nation with a vision so compelling that even people who oppose civil rights are moved by the sheer power of the words. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. This line, which will be quoted more than any other, which will be invoked by politicians and activists and ordinary people for decades, which will be used both to honor King's legacy and sometimes to distort it. This line comes from the deepest place in King's heart because he's not just a leader in this moment, he's a father thinking about his actual children, Yolanda and Martin III and Dexter and Bernice, thinking about the world he wants them to inherit, and his voice cracks slightly when he says it because it's not abstract political theory, it's personal hope mixed with desperate love. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. He's completely improvising now, weaving together themes from different sermons and different moments, combining images he's used before but never quite assembled like this, and the speech is becoming something more than a speech, it's becoming a vision of America that doesn't exist yet but could exist if enough people believe it, if enough people fight for it, if enough people refuse to accept that the present reality is the only possible reality. Behind him on the stage, the other civil rights leaders are exchanging glances because this wasn't the plan, this wasn't normalcy, never again, this is something else entirely. And they're not sure whether to be thrilled or terrified because King has gone off script at the most important moment of the civil rights movement and nobody knows how this improvisation will end. But Mahalia Jackson is smiling because she knows exactly what she did, knows that her 5 words, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," were the spark that ignited the most famous 6 minutes of oratory in American history, and she's watching King do what he does best, not deliver carefully crafted arguments but preach truth with the full force of his conviction, and she can see the crowd responding not with their minds but with their spirits, not analyzing his logic but feeling his vision. King builds to his conclusion, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, drawing on the deep well of black church tradition where words aren't just communication but communion, where speeches become prayers and prayers become prophecies, and he ends not with the prepared closing about going back to communities and continuing the struggle but with words from an old Negro spiritual that he transforms into a declaration of faith. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The moment Martin Luther King Jr. steps away from the podium, his advisors rush to him with expressions that mix congratulations and confusion because they had copies of Normalcy, Never Again, and what he just delivered wasn't that, wasn't what they spent weeks crafting, wasn't the carefully calibrated message designed to inspire supporters without alienating potential allies, and they want to know what happened, why he abandoned the script, whether he realizes what he just did. King, still catching his breath, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through his body, looks at them and says simply, "It felt right," and Mahalia Jackson catches his eye from across the stage and he nods at her because both of them understand what just happened even if nobody else does yet, that sometimes the most important words aren't the ones you write down but the ones you've been carrying. The "I have a dream" speech becomes instantly iconic, newspapers print it in full, television stations replay it, people quote phrases in conversations across the country, but what most people don't know, what doesn't make it into the history books for years, is that it wasn't really a speech at all, at least not in the traditional sense of a prepared text delivered as written, it was improvisation, spontaneous preaching. A moment when Martin Luther King Jr. trusted his instincts over his preparation and gave voice to something he'd been developing for years in black churches where nobody was recording and nobody was taking notes but where the vision was being refined, being tested, being shaped into something that could move not just a congregation but a nation. The prepared speech that King set aside, Normalcy, Never Again, is preserved in archives, and historians who read it marvel at how forgettable it is compared to what he actually said, how the policy recommendations and constitutional arguments pale in comparison to the soaring vision of children holding hands across racial lines, of former slaves and former slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood, of a nation finally living up to the ideals it claims but has never fully practiced. In the 5 years between the March on Washington and his assassination in 1968, King gives hundreds more speeches, writes books, wins the Nobel Peace Prize, continues fighting for civil rights and economic justice and peace, and he sometimes uses the "I have a dream" framework again in various contexts. But it never quite captures the same magic as that August afternoon in 1963 because you can't recreate spontaneity, can't manufacture the kind of moment when preparation meets inspiration and produces something greater than either could achieve alone. When King is killed on a Memphis balcony 5 years later, the "I have a dream" speech becomes his most enduring legacy, the words people remember most, the vision that outlives the violence, and it's fitting somehow that his most famous words weren't carefully written or formally approved but spoken in the moment, improvised under pressure, called forth by a friend who knew he had something more to say than what was on the page. Something truer than what any committee could craft, something that could only come from the place where conviction meets courage and produces prophecy. August 28, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. walks to a podium with a typed speech titled, "Normalcy, Never Again." Nobody remembers that speech. Because it was never delivered. Halfway through reading it, a woman behind him, Mahalia Jackson, the greatest gospel singer of her generation, shouts 5 words, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He pauses, pushes the typed pages aside, and speaks 6 minutes that weren't written down, weren't rehearsed, weren't approved by any committee. 6 minutes of pure improvisation. 6 minutes that changed America. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. Those words, the most quoted line from the most famous speech in American history, came from a father's heart, not a strategist's mind. They came because Mahalia Jackson knew Martin Luther King Jr. was reading the wrong speech and had the courage to interrupt him in front of 250,000 people. They came because King trusted that interruption more than his preparation. That's what courage looks like. Not having all the answers written down. Not following the script when the script isn't enough. But trusting that when the moment is right and the cause is just, the words will come. They came on August 28, 1963. And we're still hearing them 60 years later. Not because they were carefully crafted, but because they were true.